Well, thank you for having me here. So I was originally going to speak on Gandhi this evening, and I had a substantial lecture prepared on the topic, but I decided it just wouldn't be the appropriate occasion because most of you are here to find out about or have been stimulated to come here because of the events in Gaza. And it seems to me my obligation now or responsibility is to respond to what's happened in the past couple of weeks. And so I'll be focusing this evening on the events in Gaza, but I'll be happy during the questions and answers to bring in Gandhi and my own impressions of where what he has to say is relevant or applicable to what's happening in the occupied territories. What I want to speak about this evening is the background to the Gaza Massacre. I'm not trying to use that language for its incendiary value, but I don't think it can be properly described as a war when the ratio of those killed is 100 to 1 by any reasonable standard. What we witnessed in the past couple of weeks was a massacre or a slaughter. It can't reasonably be called a war if by war we mean an exchange of fighting between two sides. So I will be referring to it as a massacre, a bloodbath, a slaughter, however it works into my remarks. When the war first began, when the massacre first began, when the massacre first began, there was a lot of speculation that it had to do with the upcoming Israeli election. I didn't think that was the case. I didn't think that was the case then, and I don't think now it was the case. There's a very good Israeli correspondent in the occupied territories named Gideon Levy, and he said at the very beginning of the events in Gaza, he said that Israel went through a very similar war 2.5 years ago in Lebanon when there were no elections. And I think that's an accurate statement. What happened in Gaza in many ways was the aftermath or the natural aftermath of what happened in Lebanon in 2006. And I'll get to that presently. It is true, and one shouldn't deny it, that there were some electoral considerations in what happened in Gaza. Israel is a Spartan-like society. It's consumed by revenge and bloodlust. Killing Arabs is a sure crowd pleaser. And the opinion polls show that during the duration of the attack on Gaza, about 90% of the Israelis supported it. And so those who sought re-election, not unsurprisingly, would think of killing Arabs as a way to garner votes. But the fact is, the Israeli leadership is genuinely quite responsible in the sense that it wouldn't sacrifice crucial state interests for the sake of an election. And where major state interests are at stake, the Israeli leaders would not conduct a major operation just for the sake of votes. That's not the way that society functions. There have been cases in 1981 when the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, he blew up the Ozark reactor in Iraq, but for electoral reasons. But when he did it, there were no real state interests at stake. Contrary to widespread belief, Saddam Hussein was not at that point in the process of making nuclear weapons. What were the main reasons for Israel's attack on Gaza? In my opinion, there were basically two reasons for the attack. first of all, to restore what Israel calls its deterrence capacity, a technical term basically meaning restoring the Arab world's fear of Israel. That was its first goal. And secondly, to turn back the Palestinian peace offensive that had been launched by Hamas the past couple of years. Let me look at those goals or aims of the Israeli attack in order. The main New York Times correspondent in the occupied territories and in Israel, a fellow named Ethan Browner, he wrote that Israel's larger concern in the war, using his words, was to reestablish Israeli deterrence because Israel's enemies are less afraid of it than they once were or than they should be. And this notion of preserving Israel's deterrence capacity has always loomed very large in Israeli military doctrine. So let's take the case of how the whole saga of Israel and Gaza began, namely the June 1967 war. It was the climax of that war when Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and assorted other territories, which won't concern us this evening. Now, it's often said that Israel went to war in June 1967 because of the blockade that the Egyptian President Nasser imposed on the Straits of Tiran, and because Israel's survival was at stake. But neither of those claims are factually true. It is correct that Mr. Nasser, or President Nasser, imposed a blockade on the Straits of Tiran after Israel laid plans and boasted about its aim to attack Syria. But the blockade that Nasser imposed was actually not very significant. Israel had very little trade going through the Straits of Tiran. And in fact, and what's little known, after a few days, Nasser was letting boats pass through the straits. In fact, there was no blockade of the Straits of Tiran. Israel also claimed, apart from the blockade, which, as I said, actually didn't exist, there was the threat to Israel's survival. But there's no evidence that the Israeli leaders ever felt a threat from Nasser or the neighboring Arab states. How do we know this? Well, there's a fairly extensive documentary record on the topic. Beginning in May 1967, all the U.S. intelligence agencies were testing the prospects and possibilities of an attack by Egypt on Israel. And they kept using the information that was provided by Israel. And each time, the intelligence agencies kept coming back with the same conclusions. Number one, that Egypt was not going to attack. And number two, if Egypt did attack, then Israel, and now I'm quoting Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president at the time, he said, according to all of our intelligence, if Egypt were to attack in collusion with all the other Arab states, according to our intelligence, said President Johnson, you would, and now I'm quoting him, allow me 1 second, you would whip the hell out of them. That was the conclusion of the U.S. intelligence agencies. Well, what did the Israelis believe? It happened that the head of Israeli intelligence was in Washington at the time, and he said to the Americans, and now I'm quoting him, he said that there are no differences between the U.S. and the Israelis on the military intelligence picture, or its interpretation.